Hello everyone, today we talk about the Western explanation of the Mongol victories in the 13th century, which is an interesting point of view as it springs straight from the contemporary evidence and sources and opinions that are actually very subtle and, as we will see, quite to the point at the end of the day. Surely the Westerners were not the only peoples to find themselves and unexpectedly confronted with the Mongol invasions, and to have experienced at a point the superiority of the invaders' arms at their own expense. Right, so we will look mainly at what was the Western European reception, in spite of the fact that this was based on the accounts of their Eastern counterparts who were in contact, and quite obviously so, with the Western powers, with the papacy, with the Holy Roman Empire, that was essentially the one against which the Mongols stopped at a point to come back. An example is, the letters sent to the Pope by the Georgians after the defeat inflicted on them by Yebe and Subotai in 1222. That, of course, were seeking for help from the West, as it had been the case the century before with the Byzantines in face of the Seljuk onslaught, hoping for help for a military expedition. And we made a video exactly about the preparations of a crusade that never came, right, against the Mongols, orchestrated by the papacy and Western powers. And such letters testify naturally the astonishment and disarray that in the same levels expressed by the letters written eventually from Hungary, Thuringia, Bohemia, or Austria when the Mongols arrived there. And we're talking about warlike peoples, renowned fighters and undefeated leaders that suddenly found themselves in the presence of armies either too unknown to them and decisively beaten by them. And it's important to stress, naturally, the differences that existed among these peoples as well, and also with the Westerners, because naturally the understanding of the world at the time was complex, but still it definitely suffered of some perspective distortion, and or however, when we speak of warlike peoples, we're talking about a pretty standard system of values that was shared by everybody, right? Fundamentally by the Mongols, by the Europeans, the Middle Easterns, but in different ways, right, that are important to stress. Being warlike doesn't necessarily mean to be particularly advanced from a military point of view. Equally with the Mongols, right, being particularly cohesive and experienced and powerful, both strategically and tactically, didn't necessarily mean that their victories were just due to some absolute superiority to core Westerners. And there is this attitude, in fact, that spread at some point in Western historiography from that in part, of course, was expressed by the same sources of the time, as they were brought down, were depressed by this sudden, terrifying onslaught that crushed essentially the best that Europe could feel at that point. But we don't have the same information about what the Mongols thought and why they retreated, and what they thought of the Westerners. We have a general idea of why they did. Of course, it was political. The Mongols were, first of all, to just assess what the situation was, and they would have perhaps launched other invasions, as it would happen later on, even though on a smaller scale, and not going more west than they did the first time, because that would be an obvious strategic need. But as you know, the death of the Great Khan brought the Mongol armies to run back to the Kurultai to elect a new leader, and they had to rush because if they wanted to participate and to share power, again, in same ways. And I made multiple videos about the Mongol invasions, and more in particular the ones of Europe, where I expressed in part the broader, if anything, not just the situation per se, but the methods that should be used to make a political and strategic analysis of the situation to determine what made things go the way they did. Right. Today we don't quite look at that overall, but we can draw some broad conclusions. Equally, we will probably, if not overlap with that, but still substantiate an important assessment. Also because the Western attitude towards the Mongols, as we've seen in other videos, changed later on. Right, as long as they weren't properly the major threat, especially to Western Europeans. As you know, the Western powers allied with the Mongols, also in an anti-Mamluk fashion, also hoping to convert the Khans to Christianity. We know that this wouldn't quite happen, but there is a lot there that, of course, speaks in a couple of generations later from the first invasion of Europe, naturally of a much fragmented Mongol power that was, in fact, becoming based on these various regional realities, say, the Volga with the Golden Horde, with Persia with the White Khanate, and so on. The political and strategic needs of which were naturally very different from the ones of the initial invasions, and that also the Westerns saw in different ways. But it's exactly this increased knowledge about the Mongols through the many missions that especially Dominicans and Franciscans that really made civilization at the time. I mean, they were partly militarized, organizationally speaking. These people basically were anthropologists, strategic analysts, political counselors, spies. I mean, they had an enormous culture, right? It already witnesses how far the West could go, whereas, not even, the Chinese Mongols eventually had the same interest towards the rest of the world as the Westerners did at the time. And in fact, I made a video just last year that the title which I don't remember, but it sounded like Western European missionaries in China, I think it was specifically, but speaking about the Mongols, of course, at that point more broadly. So John of Plano Carpini, other authors, William of Rubruck, that we will discuss today, and that really show an incredible intelligence, insightfulness, and understanding that are extraordinary, really, for the means of the time. It really makes you see how much more developed these people were compared to today, from a mental point of view. Because the problem was quite concrete. Hell, the Mongol armies fundamentally entered Germany. Some detachments even crossed the Alps into Italy. So we're talking about something really wild that roamed in a good half of Europe, practically unstopped. Because even those parties that could score some victories against some raiders or some fortresses that resisted, are obvious considering also the political fragmentation of the time. The fact that the Mongols did stop and weren't even going so seriously into some kind of conquest and occupation in that way. So what is extraordinary, in fact, about the Western texts is their number. Already the civilizational capacity to produce a vast amount of reliable information that we'll see now that were used by this thick net of informers who were in contact with the top leaders of the time, such as the Holy Roman Emperor and the Roman Pope. And these are reports from very good observers, as we were saying. Such testimonies are all the more valuable since the world in which the Mongols lived was most foreign to the usual horizons of the 13th century Latins. I made a video also on the Western knowledge of Asia before the Mongol conquests that explains more or less where the Westerners were coming from a bit with the ideas that could concern even just the origin of the Mongols, of who they were, what they were coming there for, and they were completely unexpected in this sense. It should also be noted, however, and this in a sense makes even more the point of the magnitude of Western textual production about the Mongols, that the Latins were in direct contact, or had a direct experience of the Mongols for a limited amount of time, and they weren't directly exposed to them as other peoples in the same continent. The campaign of 1221-1222, from which the Georgians, the Cumans, and the Russians had to suffer, took place too far from the central nerves of medieval Christianity, right? Even the Hungarians, that were geographically closer and would later suffer of the same of the wave of 1238, 1241, wouldn't essentially perceive but just weakened echoes of that first wave of the 20s. And this is interesting, especially considering the Hungarian relation with the Cumans, that were a bit the pre-Mongols from a Western perspective. I mean, there were these people from the steppe, as you know, that stretched essentially from the lower Danube to Central Asia, scattered in various confederal agglomerations that had been harassing, especially Central Europe, launching devastating raids that reached also Germany at the time of the struggle between Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick. We made a video about that. And the same Cumans against whom King Andrew II of Hungary had sought to protect himself by appealing to the Teutonic Knights that, as you know, were first settled by the Hungarians in Romania at the border with the Cumans, right, to eventually move in the Baltic later on. But the first threat was the Cuman horde. And it seems, even though we're not dramatically informed, but that the Hungarians in the 20s of the 13th century didn't realize that even the wave of Cumans that were essentially pushing west as refugees from the Mongol advance was linked, in fact, to this phenomenon, to the severe lesson inflicted on them by the Mongols, for even the same Hungary to worry about that. And in fact, this was eventually criticized by other foreign rulers, by essentially saying that the Eastern Europeans had not prepared adequately to the Mongol invasion over the years, had disregarded them initially as just another steppe peoples that, however, was they hadn't recognized being very different from whatever had appeared in the steppes objectively. And it was therefore only between 1238 and 1241 that the Mongols were really discovered by the Westerners. As you know, they penetrated into Russia, Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and even Austria. Yet they withdrew, as we were saying before, as quickly as they had come, without maintaining occupying cores. John of Plano Carpini only encountered the Tartars, as he calls them, later on, after leaving the Russian principalities later on. And the Mongol control over the Rus also remained somewhat loose, although the same Plano Carpini had met at the court of the Khan, the same Russian dukes that were tributary to him. We will talk more about that, because at some point the papacy with Alexander the Fourth conceived a project of federation of the Russians, the Lithuanians, and the neighboring peoples belonging also to Latin Christianity, in order to constitute a bulwark, a barrier against the Mongols, right? And this project was thwarted by the changing sides of the Lithuanian ruler Mindaugas and the Russian one, Alexander Nevsky, that basically accepted the Mongol tributes, essentially to share power with them in Eastern Europe. And so this went frustrated. And objectively, these peoples have to be understood, because they were the ones who had actually suffered the brunt of the Mongol onslaught, and also were threatened of annihilation more directly. So, as you know, especially Russia was heavily Mongolized in many ways, and the political and social upheaval caused in Eastern Europe by the Mongols is something that still dramatically informed the culture of those lands. Still, you would be surprised, but to this very day, as it was devastating, was apocalyptic. Right, the Eastern Europeans lived this experience in a much dramatically traumatic and devastating way that anything that was even perceived in the West. That, however, was worried by these calls for help. And at that time, that is around the 60s of the 13th century, there was again fear of an invasion, and not without reason, because the great Mongol Khan had decided to resume the plan of world domination drawn up by his predecessors. But if the expected offensive actually occurred on an important scale in Syria and Mesopotamia, it proved to be, really something else on the side of Europe. Both because of the lack of understanding between Mönke and the successors of his uncle Batu. The Golden Horde was already kind of, controlling a bit the eastern pressure, but still ideally cooperating with the greater Khanate. And due to the small numbers of the same forces, like that were not like before, at least had a narrower scope. It is true that a campaign of devastation tried Poland, but Hungary itself this time did not suffer too much like in 1241. Poland would suffer 3 Mongol invasions, and they were fundamentally one, say, less powerful than the other over time. This is a moment also of greater say, disgregation of the Mongol Khanate, if anything, from a political point of view, and so the initial tide was practically irreplicable already, and by the way, these raids were also joined by other peoples. Sometimes you wouldn't be surprised to hear the word saying Europeans. We have seen it in part with the same Rus that were tributaries to the Mongols, and they risked annihilation had they not provided help to them. It's also from this moment that military cooperation began, actually between the Latins and the Mongols of the Ilkhanate against the Mamluks of Egypt, that, as you know, also managed to stop the Mongol advance in Syria, and otherwise it would have been possible for the Mongols to take over the same Near East and Egypt. And history would have gone very, very differently. So we discern a change of attitude already in the questions that the Westerners were asking about the military power of the Mongols, because their strategic interests had changed. At this point, the kings of France were seeking an alliance with the Mongols in order to take over Egypt and eventually Palestine by retaking Jerusalem as the ultimate goal. There were intense diplomatic negotiations also regarding the possibility of converting to Christianity that the Mongols considered. At least it would have probably never happened because of the same nature of Mongol power in a way, but still this was an option that the Mongol rulers, now that were controlling sedentary populations, were largely monotheistic, or at least, tending toward that direction, now needed to say to be more akin to, also in mindset, in the forms of power, of hierarchy. From 1238 to 1260, the Europeans basically were trying to evaluate what kind of threat the Mongols could pose to Europe, right? To know whether such invasions could repeat themselves, and this remarkable minds entrusted with the task of investigating sought instead later on those elements that could implement an effective cooperation with the Mongols. And finally, Marco Polo and his emulators, let's say, do not go that far in that direction either. They are mostly interested in describing now the vestige of a stabilized civilization that had largely also Sinicized at that point, and that there were many Europeans actually living in China, very large communities of Christians properly that were in part already there historically. And this was thanks to the same Pax Mongolica that had opened the Eurasian routes. So instead of the previous political, politics that had fragmented the same pathways into these various domination exacting tolls and tribes, and therefore rendering things more complicated, could leave as it wouldn't basically happen by land up to a short while ago, and probably never, because it would mostly travel eventually by ship and plane as the centuries progress. So as never in history, this connection between East and West through the Silk Route. So from 1238, and especially from 1241, so the attacks on Russia and Poland and Hungary respectively, the West had every reason to be concerned about the Mongols, about which they knew still too few, right, to even feel safe about themselves, as they probably and largely were, because this is what frankly emerges from the Mongol invasion of Europe, that this thing could probably not make a headway, and that much of the mythology created about the Mongol Empire does stem also from this specific Western perspective, was still pretty much amazed and kind of unaware of the broader balance of power that probably wouldn't favor the Mongols at all on the long run, had they even decided to launch a massive expedition to try to subjugate the European continent as a whole, or at least Central Europe to start with. Now, two questions preoccupied the Latins at this point. There was a first question, which was intelligently, why are the Mongols doing this in the first place, right? These people to whom the Westerners were aware of having caused no harm because they had never known them before, was attacking them. And so there had to be a meaning, a logic, even if, of course, the Westerners were not strangers to, to basic politics and strategy, like, and the expansional power of the same West at that point was being hardly felt. Okay, the broader ecumenic and even metaphysical meaning and properly the role of these people in the universe was unknown. There were a few reasons being discovered. I mean, some potential casus belli. That is to say, first of all, the disappearance of the ambassadors sent by Batu Khan to the King of Hungary, and also the welcome given by the latter to the Cuman refugees that could provide with the Mongols with pretexts for attacking at least Hungary. But behind this reason, a much more formidable motive for war was soon discovered, to which apparently the only alternative were either victory or subjugation, because the first ambassadors sent by the Pope to the Tartars as well as to the Archbishop Peter of Russia, to whom Innocent IV had submitted a veritable questionnaire, gave the same response. We quote here, "The King of the Tartars only asks for one thing, universal sovereignty and domination over the whole world. He does not want the death of anyone, and he allows everyone to keep his own religion as soon as an act of obedience has been made to him." So this was, of course, the Mongol mentality of oceanic rulers that had to rule the world entire. This was basically the purpose of any power at the time. The same Europeans understood it well. Of course, the Mongols at this point were providing with an example of that in a much more brutal, direct, and especially greater scale that no other power up to that point, even just extensionally sufficient, and nobody else in history, if we just measure it on the base of amount of territory of land conquered. That doesn't necessarily mean having been the most powerful empire in history, really showed. But this was also an ideal answer response, right? It just what it showed rather was the scale, again, by which the Mongols could afford this dramatic strategic projection, capacity, to the point of coming to threaten the conquest of practically all Eurasia, and the possibilities of the objective possibilities and capacities of other powers that were quite limited in many ways. And this doesn't mean, of course, that the latter were less in that regard, because we all know that the Mongol Empire disappeared quite soon, right? Whereas broader areas of civilizations really took over the world in a moment where the Mongols had basically fallen into a condition of, if not inoffensivity, but could be checked by other powers that also hadn't essentially been larger than their previous empire. Think about the same China later on. But alongside the motives which drove the so-called Tartars to attack Christianity, there were also others connected to the mindset at the time. That is, first of all, how is it possible that these men, even assuming they are, because they thought there were some sort of monsters coming from the lands of Gog and Magog, some kind of biblical punishment for the sins of Christians that were not even to be, counted as human beings by a degree. That's the same, more or less the same ideas that the Huns had lent to the Romans back in the day, because also they looked quite differently, and we will see that these aspects counted in a broader assessment, because up to that point the Westerners were pretty self-confident in their own military capacity. So how was it possible now that the Mongols would simply arrive in that fashion, even managing to crush some of the most powerful European armies at the time? Think about the Germans and the Poles at Legnica, or the Hungarians at Mohi in 1241. So when looking at this set of peoples all together, for example, the Russian princes, the Polish dukes, and their allies, the same king of Hungary that everybody knew had a powerful army, right? Was a strong ruler, right? Had been overwhelmed by the Mongol tide. Let's leave aside, of course, the fact that, as we were saying, the Mongols didn't quite occupy permanently this land. They settled still within the realm, essentially, of a steppe dimension, but still surely managing to turn some of these powers into direct tributaries, especially the Russians. But the highest proof of civilizational power, their military might, being crushed so openly in open field, face to face, naturally sparked the interest, and also provoked the pride of essentially warlike cultures like the Western ones and others, to say what is about the Mongol military instrument that is able to score these success, these victories. You see, the Westerners, we've seen it often in our medieval warfare videos, were deservedly proud about their warfare, right? Especially the knightly elite, and at this point in the 13th century, which is the peak of feudalism, a feudal hierarchy and warfare in general, had hegemonized the European continent, was even just visually embodying a dramatic moral and material superiority. Think about their armament, their tactics, did assure them an undisputed superiority over other peoples. This had been confirmed during the Crusades, that from a tactical point of view definitely showed the superiority of Western warfare. Doesn't matter how these wars ended. That's a broader political problem that intertwines with the military one altogether as a cause of it, right? Including the scarce participation of the Westerns to the Crusade, all the social problems also that were relatively present, at least in the Near East. This idea of the East being tamed, or at least being won in battle, was pretty evident, right? Had been consolidated, and so provided that the Christian knights avoided acts of indiscipline and above all aroused the divine wrath by their sins, there would have been no reason to pretend they could be defeated by anyone. So, as we will see, this will bring some interesting explanations, because the moral aspect was decisive in many ways. The Mongol victories forced the Europeans to question this superiority, at least, right? Doesn't mean that, the Vulgata is, the Mongols arrived, defeated everybody, and so this means that they were just hyper advanced and super. No, right? There is a lot of mythology about the Mongol military. There is no doubt that probably together with the Roman army, they were the greatest military machine in history, but a machine can break down in many ways, right? And even just a comparison with the Roman Empire is simply something else. You understand, even just in resilience, what is the extension of power if you can't hold it? What are the premises of these power? Being a steppes people it's a big deal, right? In part, it does explain, as we were saying yesterday, but as we will also conclude with today, this superiority. But the superiority was relative, right? And wars are not won just, with these couple of battles. Also in countries that were, yes, powerful, but not as politically and socially solid as the West. I mean, Russia was not Germany, as Germany was not France, etc. So this happens often also later on in the Middle Ages, of kind of almost idealizing abstractly and without context, say, some victories in the history of the art of war, as if they by themselves would have, accounted for the entire system, let's say on a continental scale. Not really, right? Some things could happen in some regions because of very specific reasons that elsewhere would have not worked, right? So there is an absolute value of any military instrument, but this adapts in a chameleon-like way, as von Clausewitz also teaches. But given that von Clausewitz teaches also that war is primarily about moral forces, the recognition of Mongol superiority in open field in those instances, even though the encounter was brief, as we've seen, and without appeal practically, because there wouldn't be any other major battle if not about, with the Golden Horde later on. Think about Kulikov, think about, there are other instances where, but those were kind of more peers at that point confronting each other, and after hundreds of years, not just of fight, but actual coexistence and hybrid. But from a moral point of view, that was shattering, because we never talked about this, but also, of course, the moral, say, the system of values of a Western knight and of a Mongol general were something importantly different, right? In deep ways, even concerning aesthetics, concerning properly broader ideals of command. This is reflected to these different systems, as we'll see now, also from a military point of view. And Europeans were devastated. Just imagine, like today, like aliens came from the outer space, you know nothing about them. They scored some major hits. They crushed, let's say, 2 major world countries, and they leave for some reason. You're pretty much freak out and try to find some kind, because you don't have terms of comparison. Again, that's why the Latins investigated so much the Mongols, because they wanted to know whether this thing could happen again, whether there was something divine in this nature of God's wrath and punishment towards the sins of the Christians, right? So for this reason, it was necessary to collect as much information as possible on the way of fighting of these new adversaries, to find an explanation for the defeats inflicted on the Christians. And I stress the Christians properly from a religious point of view, because still even the secular military ethos was deeply intertwined with that. And so even though we have less information about from knights, say, about what they thought about Mongols, still even the military interest towards the same Dominicans and Franciscans is very high, and actually spot on by some degree, considering their background. So speaking of the authors, we find these informations among those who kept in writing the memory of the hardships inflicted, for example, on Hungary and its neighbors by the invaders, such as the historian Thomas of Split of Spalata. Also in the many letters written in Central Europe, where also, documentary production was kind of higher in absolute terms than in the eastern lands, and were addressed to the Christians of Western Europe that were also their neighbors, to inform them of the disaster. These letters were collected by the English historian Matthew Paris, famously enough, when he was in view to write his Chronica Maiora, and in which one finds even in the informations of Mongolian origin, in part, because this actually came from prisoners taken by the Christians and who served in the Mongolian army, right? And there were even Christians that had served in the Mongol army, and in which one even finds information of Mongol origin coming from prisoners taken by the Christians, and therefore troops that had served in the Mongol army. And interestingly enough, some of these people were European. And they weren't just, say, Russian or Poles. No, there was also an Englishman who was captured in Austria, from which the clerk Yves de Narbonne reports the statements and also the informations that the same Mongols entrusted at a point to a bishop of Hungary after they had temporarily occupied the land, who also wrote one of these letters. So as you probably realize, there is a lot of other sources that we lost, and still, in the memory of a great part of Europeans on the eastern side of the continent, there was probably a direct experience of coping with the Mongols, which is terrifying. It was not just, of course, because they suffered killings or raping, etc., but it's because they just did this. These armies had to be stationed somewhere. They had to take contact with the locals for the supplies, everything. So there had been a cooperation, and they had interpreters, guides, etc. And this aspect is unfortunately not documented, but it's kind of obvious, and it's important to picture. In the aforementioned answer of the Russian Archbishop Peter to the questionnaire, which had been submitted to him on behalf of the Pope, also we find interesting insights, but the most complete informations come from the reports of the messengers that Innocent IV sent to the Mongols in order to propose them a pact of non-aggression and to invite them to embrace the Christian faith. And we're talking about André de Longjumeau, Ashlyn of Cremona, who was a Dominican, and John of Plano Carpini, who was a Franciscan, and a disciple of St. Francis in Umbria, interestingly enough. So the last of these reports, in particular John of Plano Carpini, is the most famous source, has come down to us in the most complete form, clearly attests that apart from their diplomatic mission, the papal envoys had to carry out a collection of information which is akin to espionage. Of course, they had, and Plano Carpini is incredibly insightful, again, about practically anything about the customs of the Mongols. So that it really provides us with the most insightful description of lots of things that also a Franciscan would understand pretty well about war. Right? Remember that Francis of Assisi himself was a knight, and so don't think that this world was sectorialized. Franciscans made civilization to a level that average people today are simply incapable of doing. Just look at people commenting on war and being light years away from any kind of strategic analytical capacity. So it's useful to compare the information about these authors also with other sources. For example, David of Ashby, who stayed with the White Khan Hulagu in Persia. Also, the information of the Armenian Prince Haitham, that was a bit in between the Franks and the Mongols. And finally, also Marco Polo. Now, the first explanation of the successes achieved by the Tartars, and doubtless the most convenient one, was that you will find in any medieval source. That is to say that whatever happens, of course, happens because God wanted this, right? And so if something bad happened to Christians, this depended on them. And so the responsibles for the defeats were mostly the Christian sovereigns' faults. And this is actually a very enlightened vision, because you think, no, this is a superstition. Well, you, as a secular modern person, are superstitious. This is a pretty spot-on moral and scientific realization. The heads of state that are also the ones that receive the decisive moral support of their community are the ones that, in a way or another, could make the difference and wouldn't, right? And just thinking that the Mongols were, again, these monsters coming from nowhere, they had superpowers, they were like the Star Wars empires, were superior to everyone, would crush everyone, it's just a superstition per se. Of course, also Eastern Europe could resist to the Mongol onslaught, and we have to presume that the Mongols actually attacked them because we're aware of their weaknesses. The Kievan Rus wasn't faring well at all, right? Other monarchies had important problems of unity. Look at Poland. We made a video about that a few months ago. The same Hungary, despite being a powerful kingdom, had its own internal issues with the baronial rule. These also problems at the boundaries with nomadic peoples that could infiltrate the eastern frontier and so on. So for a long time, the narrators of the Crusades had systematically attributed already the failures suffered by the Crusaders to the punishment for the sins they had committed. We have seen it in many Crusader battles, tactical analysis, that the sources, of course, mostly speak of the faults of some individuals, and some of that is rhetorical, but the truth of it was political entirely, because expressing such a judgment on a ruler equated to criticize fundamentally his behavior, right? They don't simply go as far, no, this king had concubines, so that's why he lost that battle. No, there is something more to that, right? It is way multidimensional, that expresses maybe the overconfidence, the lack of knowledge, reconnaissance on the enemy forces, some pressure from the within. So it's actually always spot on. But the general picture, of course, is that this whole thing sums up in the idea that you hadn't been the best that you can be. All right? That was the philosophy of the time, that the same Mongols believed in, by the way. The same Emperor Frederick II was also directly involved in the fashion, because the Mongols basically entered Germany, and he had to make a pretty important survey and set up some provisional measures for that. Believed that, because he wrote this, quote, "It was not without a just judgment from God in order to correct and chastise his people that the Mongol invasion had taken place." The Russian princes had been taken by surprise because they had neglected to defend themselves. As for the Hungarians, they had paid for their boasting and the contempt in which they had held their enemies. Right? This can be a biased view, but don't think it's that far from the political reality in some instances. There is another explanation that is equally convenient in a way, that is also more subjective. That is to say, the impression that sedentary peoples had of always being invested by these human tides of barbarian nomads, that at the end of the day weren't that numerous at all, or even if they were, in part, it's because they were, like in the case of the Mongols at this point, they necessitated of important means, given they were pushing thousands of kilometers into hostile territory, and they needed to supply themselves to have the means properly of deterring some any possible opposition that could cripple the possibility of coming back, right, as an army, right, home. So in Matthew Paris, we find expressions that are, typical of Middle Latin literature, like exercitus infinitus. Frederick II speaks of an equally immense and incomparable power and number. And for the power, they were probably right, because again, they were objectively carrying out a a massive strategic and logistical feat. The Landgrave of Thuringia goes as far as saying that the Mongol army covered an area corresponding to a distance of 20 days' march in length and 15 in breadth, which is quite imaginative. Other sources, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, noted that the Tartars did not form this army alone because they had associated themselves in large numbers with, quote, bad Christians and Cumans. The latter being already known, especially in Germany, for this kind of savage and marauding behavior, right? They were already, as we've seen, from Hungary, entering Central Europe and being used properly as auxiliary troops from the steppes. And we know that the Mongols had subjugated these peoples during campaigns, so they would oblige them to follow them in this. And naturally, especially the nomadic ones were just up to it by themselves, because they normally joined whichever army came in large numbers, because they knew they could simply lay waste everything thanks to the deterrence offered by that army. So they wouldn't even be paid or anything. They just looted, and that's how it were paid. Also, Europeans would use them later on in the same way. And plus, there were surely there were Eastern European contingents, or even, as we've seen, turncoats from, I don't know, there wasn't even an Englishman. What the hell was an Englishman doing in a Mongol army captured in Austria? Well, there were, because people traveled. Moreover, there were simple questions about where did these people come from? Like, who the hell they are, right? Frederick II, so to give an answer, this very surprising theory in Mongol migration and genesis, as they essentially were described as proliferating like, quote, like caterpillars by settling on the borders of the northeast of the known world, spreading from there. And aside from the dehumanizing metaphor that was, pretty common in all cultures at the time, but this is not very far from the truth. Just yesterday we were talking about this. I mean, up to the 12th, 13th century, the Mongols were just primitive and relatively, irrelevant people in pretty wild, underdeveloped area. And so, explaining also the Mongol invasion in itself, consider the Mongols knew Christianity, they knew Islam, they knew there were these other civilizations around from ever, right? So nobody was ever completely unaware of the rest of the world. Just, it was incredible for Europeans that these people would come out of nothing. They thought they were nesting like caterpillars to eventually blossom in this dreadful fashion to harass them. In military matters, if we leave aside the matter of numbers, the first question, however, that seems to interest Europeans is the Mongol armament, probably by reflection of the knightly elite interest, given that these were the same people that ruled at every level. The same kings and emperors were knights, right? So they just the military might of a country was measured primarily on the base of these troops. And as you know, the average equipment of a European milas at this point was pretty heavily cuirassed one, right? At this point, the iron helmet encloses the wool head, the horseman is covered in iron. Some horses are to just the ultra elite, right? There is some things that starts appearing, especially in the 13th century, not dramatically documented, because very often we don't even understand from iconography where it's, I don't know, cuir bouilli or metal or something. And the main advantage, in a sense, is that they were immune to practically most arrows that would come at them. And just their weight, their training, their horse breeds, their collective, uh, let's say, exercising, would make them in hand-to-hand combat an almost irresistible force. Like a Western cavalry charge was recognized by anyone, by the Byzantines, by the Arabs, like unstoppable. Right? They thought that Westerners were barbarians, they were unruly, they were indisciplined, etc. But whenever they mounted on horseback and they charged, especially together, they were something. And this was the pride of the West in many ways. And as we were saying before, in the Crusades, it had fundamentally worked. Right? This ultra elite of feudal Europe had managed with significant support also from the commoners, from missile troopers. We will see about the crossbow later, that the Mongols ignored, in spite being very technologically advanced at that point, especially by Chinese influence. However, so this, say, maybe a technologistic and materialistic bias, but still at the time they cared about this aspect. At least it was discussed, because they found out that the Mongols had a very different armor, which, however, was of excellent quality. And it sounds, we have seen just yesterday some archaeological recording of these armor, and we have to think that it was very, let's say, you see, Western civilization was growing in a much more orderly way, right? Probably coalescing step after sound. The Mongols had just exploded from the steppe, and so even their technology sometimes was very, patched together in a very empiric way, but still a very functional one, because it had been battle tested, campaign tested, right? And this Mongol armor, noted Thomas of Split, quote, is made of thick coverings of bull hide like plates, but impenetrable and very steady. So in part organic material. Also, the Westerners had padded coats, but they had a slightly different concept behind that, right? These were, hardened leather, say, hides that worked in a sense like plate armor. This stuff, as you know, there is a huge debate about, what were Europeans using, because this thing normally rots away, so we don't know by which extent were they. But sources do not suggest that it was widespread, not even particularly spread, especially in Western warfare. In Mongol warfare it was different. Frederick II speaks of, quote, raw leather of oxen, donkeys, or horses on which iron plates are sewn. But so a sort of brigandine at the end of the day, because that's what the same concept is. But adds that when the Tartar chiefs took the armor of Christians, of whom they had defeated, they preferably adopted them to theirs. And this is interesting. I mean, Frederick II of Hohenstaufen was surely, an embodiment of Western pride in absolute terms. But we do, and it's pretty obvious, know that that Mongols would use armor from the places they subjugated. You see, with Western Europeans, we don't have that prolonged contact for which, I don't know, if the Mongols had established a khanate in Poland or Hungary, probably it would have been more evenly, Western influence, right? We mostly have, as we were talking about yesterday, some heavily, for example, Persian influence, not just from the Ilkhanate, but also spreading in Central Asia. Well, in China, of course, in the same way, in Eastern Eurasia, the same Mongolia being importantly affected by this. It was a melange deriving from various cultures at the same time, including some pre-existing ones of the steppes that were more advanced than the Mongol at some level. Some peoples, like the Kyrgyz, sometimes had, an important material culture that was even more advanced than the Mongol one in the steppe originally. But there are conflicting opinions. Like, for example, the Englishman captive who informed Yves of Narbonne says that the Mongol armor was of boiled leather. That these armors were not only impenetrable but light, right? Which also Peter of Russia and the anonymous Hungarian bishop also tell us. Plano Carpini and Simon de Saint-Quentin was another, I think it was a Dominican, go into more precise details. So the Mongol cuirass would be made up of straps superimposed and sewn together, in Latin ad modum patellulae, that is to say, kind of like sort of scale armor of lamellar armor, depending on what to consider a patellula is, but just little plates that are sewn together again by this on this organic support, presumably. But not only, also maybe interspersed. There was probably an important degree of, let's say, of heterogeneity, as we've seen yesterday, and we will repeat today. Also, Mongol armor was different, seemingly in this, especially consistency in this penetrability, depending whether it was the front or the back. The back was weaker, and part of the reason was probably that it was considered a kind of for taking the frontal brunt mostly of arrow fire, but not only, of course, also larger impact from the front, but not just like the Westerners would develop with chest plates and so on. Also, this armor is reinforced by 2 iron plates protecting the shoulders, which is something that we have seen in a quite early Cuman armor to be found in Hungary that, in this sense, make us think that probably influenced the same development of plate armor in Europe, because it's exactly in the mid-13th century and in Eastern Germany the first plate armor spreads. And it's probably connected to the fact that was the frontier with the Mongol invasion forces, and eventually that spread all over Europe in a few decades. It was pretty universal. So it's not that the Mongols made it, but it's possible that the design and the need, especially against the volume of fire of Mongol armies, probably required this increased anti-missile protection, and the same Cumans probably didn't have this before they met the Mongols. So this Mongol cuirass, according to these authors, also descended on only to the belly, differently from the Western mail that descended to the knees. But the horse is also protected by a set of 5 pieces of leather, one of which on the front goes down to the knees of the animal, which also reinforces what we were saying before about the need of an increased protection especially from arrow fire. And you know that horses are terribly resilient but also delicate animals. So you take the famous arrow to the knee, and that your horse is crippled for good. And this stuff was, I don't know, Niketas Koniatas famously talks about Hungarian cavalry, the Battle of Semlin in 1167, having this kind of chest plates for horses, etc. That may be that early experiments in Europe, also because of this more kind of steppes influenced Magyar experience. Also, an iron plate served as a frontal, right? And that was what we were talking about, because if I'm not wrong, that Byzantine Chronicle says properly that it was a plate. I consider that Niketas is from, it's kind of from the same times here. The Mongols had not yet arrived. So it's all the more relevant to see that, the West reason, as we've seen, the same horse armor in Central Asia was more common. In the West, basically, they were just starting to need to use metal armor for horses as well. But again, it derived from the context, not from the idea that it's an absolute superior inferior type of advancement. As we've seen, there were lots of things that the Mongols, that as technologically advanced as they were, they ignore, and vice versa. let's say, and even actually the Westerners didn't. It doesn't seem there to be, except for this armor that was apparently so extraordinary to them. But still, there is no evidence, apologically speaking, that the Mongols had this, particularly advanced kind of armor, say, to the point that would constitute a tactical advantage of greater form. There are areas that surely, yes, we were saying yesterday in the Yangtze River area, show metallurgic advancement of armor that was probably superior to the same one of the West, but we're talking of these are pre-industrial societies, very, very scarcely differing in technology, right? War, again, is made up by moral forces, political and social, and thus military organization, and much of what that civilization can bring on the field in that humanly coordinated fashion more than else, and that's where the Mongols themselves were so effective in. It could carry out these feats that Europeans said, wow. So the impenetrable character of the armor struck the Westerners, right? Probably also because it was not made entirely of plates, right? Just per se, or of metal plates, and it was this kind of hybrid. And according to Western sources, this armor spared the Mongols the disadvantages that chainmail did not avoid. In a sense, Jean de Joinville, for example, describes to us, as you know, biographer of Louis IX. He was a crusader, a knight, a nobleman of France. Described these combats in which the knights, riddled with arrows, which stuck in the stitches, looked like pink cushions without having to leave their post or without having serious injuries. But he also tells us that all the scratches caused by such wounds forced the knights, once they had taken off their hauberk, to remain several days without being able to put it on again, because it doesn't matter how small these wounds were, they were painful and many, right? So they inflamed various areas. Mongol armor appears to have been tighter. As a result, it rendered practically useless the use of the shield, which, as we've seen, and also the same Western sources realize, is because of different reasons. This Mongol armor was worn just by the elite. The majority of Mongol horsemen was unarmored, right, or practically so. So horse archers have in their protection archery, right, not large shield that hampers their movement and would make him less agile to run back and forth and exploit all the advantage that type of trooper is designed to have as a skirmisher. But it's true that, of course, the more heavily armored troops would necessitate of less protection if, in fact, armor was enough. And this would happen in the same Western warfare, right? And it was already happening, actually, in Western warfare, as at this point, Western shield was becoming smaller and smaller, but it was still larger and, in that sense, a bit more troublesome than the very light, weaker shield the Mongols had. Again, they stem from two different contexts, so just looking at the shield per se is not an indicator. The Western knight could still be facilitated in some things by his shield. But it's the increase of armor that definitely shows this. And the idea, of course, is that the Steppes elite had a pretty, remarkable metallurgic capacity, let's say, at least the background of these peoples for the elites wore armor that was designed to resist this mostly cavalry warfare impacts, and especially hairs of arrows. So it may have seemed from a Western perspective this armor was particularly advanced. But this was only worn by a part of the Mongols. In fact, Simon de Saint-Quentin estimates that it was worn only 1 in 10 fighters. Plano Carpini specifies that these solidly armored warriors formed only the first line of battle. And it makes a lot of sense because this was the same exactly in the West, which supports the idea of a knightly bias towards their counterparts, right? Saying, we are the ultra heavily armored elite. Let's see what these other guys use, and wow, that's pretty cool. And probably there was some kind of edge given in hand-to-hand combat, in ideal parity that does not exist in warfare, but that was considered. But these men who felt also pretty much, of course, the physicality of it also. Armor does make a difference, but again, let's not think that this was a game changer. As an offensive weapon, of course, the bow struck mostly the attention of the Westerners, who, as we will see, didn't think actually much about the Mongols' swords, which also is interesting because swords are designed to cope with armor. Even though people say, but swords do not cut through armor, but it's exactly the point. I mean, they're ideally designed, especially still at this point where the blade was everywhere pretty much evolving always this to achieve this greater, this sharper edge for the sake of cutting until plate armor came in, right? Well, the sword modifies radically. It's all about the fine grains that could allow, with a very powerful blow, to also inflict damage to the armor, as much as it would receive in parts of the same sword. But the evolution of sword and armor goes in parallel, right? So if this armor the Mongols wore was so terrific, but the Westerners themselves didn't think too much of their swords, there might have been some kind of misassessment from the sources in some way, or at least in some aspect of this, some balance of this assessment. And the bow was reputed as formidable. This we know, that of course the composite bow of Asian origin was much more performing than the Western simple bow. That was pretty much the same in Western Europe since prehistory. And the Mongol bow robustness struck all the authors that talk about it. David of Ashby describes its shape, that of the Turkish bow, he says. However, we note that even here, not all fighters were equipped with this particularly heavy and robust bow type, right? Some had lighter bows, and in this case, Plano Carpini tells us that each of these archers had 2 or 3 bows, right? And the strength and skill of the archers also strikes all the authors. Of course, these peoples were habituated to specialize mostly in archery. Horse archery, these people lived on horseback their entire life, literally, and they fought mostly with bows, right? So that's basically all they knew. They were all one with a horse and with a bow. There was no distinction. They didn't have any other mental horizon. And the arrows were attracting the attention of Western authors as well. Thomas of Split notes that the Mongol arrow is 4 fingers longer than the Western one, and it ended in a piece of iron or bone or horn, which also suggests probably different, ethnic backgrounds from the same, what we consider as the Mongol army, that probably had different, everything was kind of tribe-made, right? So every this one was kind of different, had kind of different traditions. Naturally, the Mongol army standardized at some point, but this mostly happened after a moment of sedentarization, right? For the rest, this equipment was just made by the nomads still living in a nomadic fashion. So they also had to adapt in more extreme ways for supplying their. Consider the Mongols were abundantly provided with arrows, which makes an overall absolute cost that we can evaluate in even the figure of million of arrows shot by a field army in a single battle, and think about just producing them. In fact, Marco Polo estimates that each archer had 60 arrows, which also corresponds to Plano Carpini's estimate, and we know from, generally speaking, the steppes tradition that this was pretty standard among various peoples, having really lots of arrows that individually were not even dramatically performing, but all together could significantly cripple and unnerve the horses, right? The alignment for the chargers and for the Westerners were so important. The horses also get annoyed by this. The Mongol arrows made this dramatic sound. It was all together with also the war cries, etc. At least at the moment of attack. So it's obviously always the moral dimension that makes a difference. But just think about carrying all these arrows, right, and how many had to be produced continuously. The composite bow, these arrows had a longer range than the Western bows, and it was used alike for hunting or against unarmored men. And then there was a specific type of combat arrow with a wide blade and a very sharp point properly. Plano Carpini says that each Mongol carries a file of these in their quiver, capable of inflicting serious wounds on the armor face and even cutting the strings of the opponent's bows. And there were different types of arrowheads. This was true also in the West, and some of it specializing also against armor, etc. And in general, it's like the sword. The fact that armor was designed to withstand blades, projectiles, etc. doesn't mean that, after 100 times it happened, something couldn't go wrong, even if the other 99 times didn't, right? So also modern estimates, the replicas, the tests, all this, as if you lived in the 13th century. Just listen to what these people say and try to form an opinion about what is also physically possible, by the way. The curved sword with a short single-edged blade, as you were saying before, appears less formidable than the Latin sword. That was larger and multi-purpose. It was just a different type of sword. Of course, it was designed for a more complete type of training and equipment than the average Mongol had. But still, the heavily armored elite of the Mongol army had this pretty massive swords that surely, the same Westerners had to be wary of. But in general, it's the concept all that wasn't particularly appreciated, and because it just fit another type of fighting that is not about one-to-one, it's about the collective dimension, right? And generally speaking, most of the Mongol army was not as well armored and armed as the average, even Western fighter. So most of the times a commoner, actually, because Western militias already at the time were better equipped, just like the one of sedentary peoples already were, right? And they had also some kind of quite performing counter capacity for Mongol archery, that is crossbows, that the Mongols didn't know. And the same Western sources say that this heavier Mongol sword, in fact, was used only by the rich. We know the rest of Mongol horsemen, actually sometimes possibly not even having a sword. It would have been a saber, however, a lightsaber in most cases. The Mongols used spears, naturally, that were, however, very different, apparently, from those of the Westerners, because according to European sources, they only struck from the side, right? And they said also the Mongols didn't practice spear fencing, which instead the Western Knight was a master of, and which allowed the enemy to be properly unhorsed. But they noticed some Mongol spears were provided with fangs in order to tear the rider from his saddle. And this concept also is interesting, because it doesn't mean actually that the Mongols didn't have a spear training, or that their spears were not designed to unhorse. It's just that on average they weren't as the Westerners. The Westerners, as we've seen, counted all in the shock charge, so they were perfectly functionalized to that, with heavy cavalry aimed at smashing and unhorsing other heavy cavalry, right? The Mongols were mostly teasers, right? So on average, they didn't need the same kind of functional frontal, smashing capacity that the Westerners had, and consequently they didn't train, and they didn't equip their troops much for that as the Westerners did. But of course they did, and of course Mongol spears could unhorse you in many ways. It's just they preferred just to try to, with this fanged spears, to hook you in a sense, and to make you lose balance. Also because the Mongols were less stable on horseback, exactly because of this reason, than the Westerners, but simply because also they were not meant most of the times as light archers to come to grips with the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. The axe and mace were thought to be considered most effective in close combat by the Mongols, which probably refers still to a sort of elite fight. This is a thing of the steppe, the idea that especially the youth has to go into this initiatory duel against the heavily armored hero unarmored, right? So doing things that has to hit armor, so that ace and maces were designed for causing trauma underneath armor, but also doing things to tease and kind of belittle the enemy, like pulling his horse's tail, that was in fact usually knotted to avoid this. We find this stuff even among, the Seljuks, that had this strong Central Asian, and they were practically Central Asians in a military culture. So this is probably how we have to interpret this Western references. There were other pieces of Mongol equipment that surprised the Westerners a lot. Almost everyone, from Thomas of Split to Plano Carpeni, was amazed at the ease with which the Mongols crossed the rivers. Advanced logistics. The Mongol armies were just larger and better organized than the Western ones, and that's what it made it. They were habituated to move very fast, also crossing lots of rivers all over Eurasia. When did in wild areas, so not where there were roads or bridges like in the West, right? When a European army had to cross the Rhine or the Danube, normally, everything was kind of much more mitigated by a sort of more civilized, sedentary environment that had, was served all by an infrastructural net. The Mongols had to normally strive against the forces of nature on a regular basis in the most desolated and terrifying environments existing on the Earth's surface. And these fordings were carried out thanks to the use of leather. Each Mongol, we are told, carried a bag of skin, which could serve as a bed, first of all, and there are leather boats, as these skins could be inflated, carrying up to 10 men, and the horses, which also crossed rivers by essentially throwing themselves in the water and swimming, but being towed by these rafts. And this was confusing for the Westerners, because they'd never done it, right? Their way of, fording rivers, it was much more, mediated, much more, less adventurous and taken with more care, right? In many ways, again, this was because Europeans didn't have armies of tens of thousands moving tens of thousands of kilometers back and forth across Eurasia. So obviously they didn't have the same Mongol logistics regarding these aspects, because for the rest, also European logistics in many ways was excellent for their own needs, right? So everything has to be understood in relative terms. And in fact, speaking of siege warfare, we are normally told the Mongols being masters in the art of storming citadels, as their, especially after their polyascetics had been refined by Chinese influence, right? And the Mongols razed to the ground major cities after having stormed them. Think about, even just in Western Eurasia, think about Baghdad. Or even they had taken what the Middle Easterns, for example, had considered as an impregnable fortress, like the one of Alamut, where the assassins where headquarters were located. The Mongols would capture them anyhow, but the Westerners didn't have this. They had they were divided regarding Mongol siege warfare capacities. For example, Ivan of Armenia says that the Tartars were very inclined to take castles and towns. Archbishop Peter of Russia, who knew how in fact the Russian cities had been washed away practically by the Mongol tide, considered the Mongol siege machines very formidable. Other informants, however, albeit knowing that the Mongols were quite ingenious in bringing down strongholds, do not seem to find their siege warfare particularly different from the European ones. Because objectively they weren't, right? The Mongols were probably more advanced than Europeans in everything. Was kind of probably incendiary mixtures and first gunpowder use that came from China. But in terms of the most standard type of siege warfare that made the thing most of the times, were pretty much the same. The same Chinese trebuchet that eventually would become the Mongol one was developed in China by Islamic military engineers during the early Middle Ages. So again, technology is not the thing. These armies were probably much more similar than we think to one another. However, the Mongols were very well organized for the convenience of a siege. This is for sure. John of Planokarpini, for example, says that each Mongol rider carries a rope, and that this makes it possible to build a larger number of throwing machines very quickly. And much of this logistical capacity naturally comes from the Mongol horse. That was a very specific breed that was habituated to resist. They had a much longer range normally of Western horses that it also was much more capable of oxygenating on the Eurasian highlands and deserts. It was really a very tough beast, but it was small in many ways. This doesn't mean much, right? Also, Western horses weren't in order to be strong, you don't have to be large particularly, and this was known also by the Westerners. The mounts of which were not massive, not even for the stallions, for the ultra heavy cavalry. In any case, if in one instance Matthew Paris says that the Mongols had big and strong horses, which surely is possible, especially for the heavier cavalry. It was surely a difference of mounts. All the rest of Western sources insist, on the contrary, that the Mongol horse is small, but robust. In fact, Thomas of Split says, Equus breves sed fortes, so short but strong horses. Adding that the Mongols also ride in the way of peasants, the fashion peasants, which refers probably to the fact that it didn't ride as the heavier cavalry, that instead was the nobility in the West. Also, he says that Mongol horses are badly trained, because he says they are bonus sed stultos, which literally means they're good but stupid, because they were untrained. The way, at least probably, was thought the top Western horses were, in that objectively were, but again, were also used in different ways. Actually, this latter information was from the Hungarian bishop, which in a sense makes it even more interesting, because in Hungary there were still kind of different varieties in the Pannonian plain of horses compared to Western Europe that were also kind of more similar to the steppe types. Also, Mongol horses didn't have shoeing, because in a way they weren't meant to impact, right, but just to run fast. They received neither barley nor oats and are very frugal in their food, which is an advantage logistically because you can satisfy them with less. Naturally, nothing compared to the great studs mounted by Western knights that instead were extremely needy, not just in the atrociously large amount of food that still Mongol horses needed, but properly from the quality of it. These were extremely delicate animals in many ways, also intestinally, etc. But what struck the Westerners is that Mongol horses were many, right? Seemingly infinite. The Hungarian bishop goes as far as saying that each Mongol rider had 20 or 30 horses. And probably this idea stemmed from the fact that many peoples that also followed the Mongols at the time migrated with their entire chattel. Plano Carpini, that is, as we've seen, more spot on, reduces the number to 3 or 4, which is still a big deal because this allowed the Mongols to have a fresh horse every day, as they let the others grazing together with the rest of the herd that followed the Mongol Armor. And this was undoubtedly an invaluable advantage tactically, whether it is because of withdrawing or pursuing, you have always a fresh mount. But hey, strategically and logistically, that was a nightmare, right? The Mongol logistics, as we've seen, was overwhelmingly advanced out of sheer practice, but this sheer practice had taught very harsh lessons to anyone who could pioneer it, as given this enormous amount of horses, there were simply some forced strategic choices that you had to follow. Like, you couldn't move these armies away from very large courses of water, and all in very specific time of the year, or naturally the rivers were full. And in this sense, we have to think of like single highways, let's say, that the Mongols were forced to cross as single options for entire regional theaters, because moving the army even a few tens of miles away from that would have literally starved or thirsted the army itself to death, right? Because the horses require a traumatically large amount of water and grazing. Like, also, you couldn't stop for too long in a certain place. This naturally increased the need of strategic projection of the Mongols, this idea of pushing far and far, because you can't literally go back the same way. In fact, if you follow the routes they used to invade Europe, they made these broad circles because, of course, they had laid waste everything. If they hadn't destroyed it for some broader reason of avoiding the locals to rebuild, Poland was destroyed in the process, by the way, just like Russia. But literally there was no grass because the horses had eaten everything. And so, while this would oblige the Mongols to go very fast and to strike at, also those flatlands and valleys were the largest settlements for the same reasons of water availability and therefore endemic and agricultural resources were, still they were practically forced to do that, right? Unless, of course, they wanted to use smaller armies with which they could go everywhere, but still with less strategic punching capacity. and this is true for every army, by the way, so it was not like much of an advantage or disadvantage the Mongols had compared to the Westerners, but still there also partly of their tactical capacity was linked to this. And so in a way they were more limited than other powers that, however, were less powerful. This is the point, unitarily taken. Europe was all fragmented politically. And speaking of tactics, everybody was amazed by the discipline of Mongol army. Western witnesses stressed this a lot. They were very much impressed by the order, by the silence, by the perfect coordination of Mongol movements. This again was the product of decades of campaigns that had taught every Mongol warrior what to do without even being asked. There were very minimal orders, signs, etc. the Mongols used, and everything flowed smoothly, right? And most Western authors focus, first of all, on organics. They describe the decimal division of the Mongol army that was divided in tens, hundreds, thousands, etc. And what is interesting about this, aside from the decimal order that is, of course, universal for humans, as we have 10 fingers, but it's not to be, directly the thing, right? This has to do mostly with the kind of neater figures that the enormous amount of horse archers of the steppes armies made more kind of the circle number necessary to organize them, the nails. European armies were still based on the decimal system, but with different numbers of tens summed for units. But what is striking is not much the decimal order, but it's the scale of it, because units of tens of thousands did not exist in Europe, right? Western contingents basically gathered in a very heterogeneous way, with each knight carrying a banner or a simple pennon with his retinue, and being grouped with others at the moment of battle, fundamentally, in the battle line. And of course, it was an order that went beyond this. In the 13th century, the system was becoming ever more professional, etc. But it was, in a way, still at the beginnings. And European armies were mostly coalition armies of people living separated, maybe even in the same country, even neighboring each other, a few tens of miles, but still kind of reasoning on their own. So this higher discipline and hierarchical system the Mongols displayed to full efficiency on the field was unknown to the Westerners. It was amazing, right? The Westerners were much more primitive in this sense. But they were also, for this reason, more flexible, in a sense, in other scenarios, probably. Not that the Mongols weren't, but, say, on a broader political and strategical level, again, try to conquer Europe, where you have to stop at every freaking castle of the hundreds of thousands that there are in a single region, and lay siege to it, and stop a 30,000 horseman army with its overwhelming logistical needs, right? And so this is what makes Europe overall, still in political and military fragmentation, still a massive civilization, because the moral material strengths of the Westerners were exactly laying the fact that they were so fragmented, and they would build armies that were, by the way, quite functional, even if they were aggregated with all these various kind of knightly retinues patched together at the moment, because they more or less all knew how to fight in that way, right? So it's just that the system from the top was not organized in the same way, because European states were coalescing, and the Mongols in practice didn't even have a state in which we intend. So in there was a moral fuel that came from the warlikeness of these people, and also from their roughness, that is what ultimately we understand made great part of the Mongol success. They also made this terrible invasion waves, and then Mongol history stopped. Right? That's basically it. Europe went on like a steamroller, which is very meaningful in comparison. There was also a very modern concept of command that Plano Carpini notices in the Mongol army, as the chiefs were less involved in first line combat, like even as we were saying before, emperors and kings in the West were primarily knights. They led from the front, they put their life at dramatic risk. Think about Richard Lionheart or others that died literally also, in actions that wouldn't deserve the death of a king. Whereas the Mongols commanded from the rear, and without that need of showing the fact that we're individual knights. Or I don't remember where Subotai, I think, was like a morbidly obese old man who traveled on a chariot, like properly built appositely, and crushed this, as we've seen, German, Polish, Hungarian armies made up of people that were young, athletic. They thought, I don't know, that having long hair was a matter of racial superiority, being beautiful, where beauty was a value. The Mongols didn't give a damn in that sense about beauty, at least in the way the Westerners did. So it was a very different view of life, of the world, of the universe. And that's why this comparison is so fascinating in many ways. So the Mongol general remains in the rear and can thus, however, intervene effectively in the conduct of operations, employing reserves in more, pre-orderly, knowing, what's going on, hopefully, from a privileged position. This in part existed in the West as well, right? Normally, the kings stayed in the second line of battle. It was in the 13th century the development of a much more mediated, in-depth deployment. So something similar was occurring in the West too, but it would take a long time, centuries, before the Western monarchs would just lead from the rear. And so a Mongol commander could follow the progress, eluding a combat participating leader in a frontline unit with all attached risks. Before meeting the enemy, according to John of Plano Carpini, the Mongols launched their runners forward. Covering the whole territory some 2 days before the arrival of the army proper. This was kind of a steps tactics aimed at, in a sense, revealing a bit the same strategic quotient of these armies. As we'll see, the Mongols didn't give battle preferably all the time. For the Westerners, it was almost an obliged choice, because their entire effectiveness was in the direct attack. So the sooner they came to grips with the enemy, the better it was. And that's also how the broader civilization had all this aggressivistic ethos of the knight charging straight, etc., because just their logistical capacities were reduced, right? It's a bit like the Germans back in the day. Why did they put everything on the charge? Basically because they had practically only infantry, and because they didn't have a state that could maintain an army for too long on the field, and because they were all politically fragmented in various clans that wanted all to, couldn't last too long, right? Even just politically on campaign. In a sense, the Westerners were still suffering in part of this, not being there a major state, like at the time of Rome, that could control those things instead. But it was also, again, a civilization that had surpassed the ancient ones at this point. So still, they had taken something away from some aspects, but also added on some others and balancing them out. So this laying waste of the territory was aimed at deterrence. The Mongols had mercilessly effective intelligence of the advantage of a terroristic policy. This wouldn't scare all the enemies. This was also, in a sense, done trying not to waste time and doing actually real damage. In part was also, of course, as we were saying, this precautional measure, reaching the enemy, testing what it was about, and letting the bulk of the forces to advance for battle if it was viable. So basically creating a screen for which you want to keep the enemy at bay simply through the distance and not, finding yourself cornered all of the sudden. The Mongols were quite good at this, and this went beyond strategy. It had to do with broader intelligence, reconnaissance, and so on. They used it against every enemy they attacked. And the same strategy is quite useful also for deceiving the enemy, because the enemy has this screen in between and doesn't factually know how far the Mongol army is, because between the screen and the army you're not. You have to cross enemy lines and hopefully coming back alive to refer if you haven't been killed by anyone in the process. And that's a typically Eastern tactics. We have seen it in many battles, also during the Crusades, massacred, where the Byzantines found out in the last days that it was the whole Seljuk army they thought to be hundreds of kilometers away. And consider the Mongol speed that we have seen being higher than what Europeans were mostly used to. So this could be really confusing, taking the enemy by surprise. And since the Mongols know that the people of the plains always tend to seek shelters in the mountainous areas, Plano Carpini says that detachments were sent to the mountains to await for the fugitives, where they could massacre them or rejecting them, repelling them. And this is interesting because it means, if anything, that the Mongols had an important speed advantage to carry that out, right? Because normally, again, communities that have to flee to the mountains because the enemy comes raiding is something that, especially communities that are exposed to this kind of raids, very often also in the East against the nomadic people, know how to do in time, right? Exactly because the enemy is famous for being so speedy, right? But this still shows, in a sense, the functionality, the standard mentality that the Mongols had, that they were habituated to replicate so easily and effectively because they had done it so many times before, and that's all what makes the difference, experience, right? So this doesn't mean that the Mongols were always successful in cutting the retreat of the inhabitants to the mountains, but they would try that at least on a regular basis. So the objective of this is to make the enemy army on its own territory in complete insecurity. That's what the Mongols aim at, scaring you. And part of this deception is connected, however, to some sort of strategic weakness. We have seen that similar tactics were used by the Magyars at the time of the 9th and 10th century, right? They were very cautious. They sent always a detachment ahead of the main body. They advanced only where they knew that they would have a terroristic capacity, because the steppes peoples, or at least those that have that influence, tend to behave like this because they know that in hand-to-hand combat normally they are inferior, right? Or at least if they don't have this broader functionalized and de facto professional character that a lifetime spent on horseback, like in the case of the Mongols, on such a large operational scale capacity, let's say, they were not able to attain so easily against Western armies that are maybe more cumbersome, but they're surely more impacting, and you want to avoid meeting face to face. In fact, the Mongols knew how to guard themselves much more carefully than the Westerners. David of Ashby entitled one of his chapters "How the Herberge is Guarded," right? And it happens to be the only one which we have the complete text of, and it's quite instructive about this topic. And the avoidance of the Westerners' frontal attack was coped with by the Mongols, telling the truth, by default against all enemies except the ones that would use their own same tactics, which was the case for basically for most of the steppes, and that's also why the Mongols fought like this, because they fought like this also among each other, right? Was to make up their center in open field of their center of their array, of their deployment, with the less secure and less solid elements, that is to say, the contingents provided by the subjugated peoples. We would have thus suffered the brunt of the enemy onslaught, would have been tested politically, let's say, in their commitment to the Mongol cause, let's put it in this way, and in contrary, yes, breaking, because the mass of the Mongols is actually deployed on the wings, and so even if the center is refused, many say, they refused the center normally, so they made a feint flight. But feint flights very often in warfare are actually real flights, right? And they are triggered by the fact if you're winning against an enemy, you don't lose ground, you don't give ground away. At best, you can stop him there, we can pin him there, and then still carrying out the envelopment with the wings, right? But this is the point. An army can't be strong in anything, especially when you have two so wildly different tactics like the Western and Mongol one. You see that somebody's strong in something and the other is weak in something, and vice versa, right? So this was the point, of course. The Mongols avoided to be attacked by the Western charges because probably they feared them, right? And if we had found a Mongol account, they surely would have stated that, even though it was not, again, as we just said, just about the Westerners, was just their standard mode of combat. But odds in warfare are always kind of evenly balanced, especially the larger the engagement. So again, yes, the Mongols won repeatedly, and that surely speaks of a systematic relative superiority, but still it's not because they couldn't lose, and they were surely doing everything not to lose. Warfare is always like this. Nobody wins just, okay, we won, that's it. No. In warfare, everything goes differently in a way that basically doesn't, in terms of what is at stake, doesn't compare with any other human activity. Also, Western sources say, interestingly enough, that the Mongols give battle only when the adversary is outnumbered. Doesn't say by how much, but still, and meaningfully so, which goes a bit against, as we've seen, that stereotype that the Mongols were so many, right? And this is also a bit, approximate, because of course it depends by how much they are outnumbered. Like, if it's 1 versus 1 numerically, would they go for it anyway? There are many other strategic factors that can influence that difference. But the idea here is that if they felt outnumbered, at least they didn't feel confident to give battle for some reason, because they didn't want to risk it. And again, remember, they're fighting tens of thousands of kilometers away from home, right? So, and especially, I'm saying really tens of thousands because the communications at the time were not the ones we have today. So we have to add some coefficient to increase the actual distance. They would initially would just test the enemy probably in that same assessment phase, right, by shooting a few volleys or arrows at them. They would withdraw, however, when they saw they wouldn't attack, to give battle at some other place, which in strategy is a form of weakness, right? It means that you're simply saying you're too strong, I'm not attack you, and so you're giving up the initiative because you're retreating factually to another position. And they would hope in the process for the enemy army to tire down, to somewhat tire itself, and hopefully beginning to disperse, because also the odds, as we've seen here, are a bit leveled, so probably not even the enemy has this dramatic advantage when spent. This is naturally for the sake of example. In many instances, the Mongols had to retreat because there were superior enemy forces that would have crushed them anyway. Simon de Saint-Quentin evokes the successive waves of archers on horseback who come to overwhelm the enemy with arrows, right? And Plano Carpini, the habit of the Mongols, if the encircled adversary holds out, of pretending to yield at one point so that the enemies rush in that point of the line in order to escape the encirclement, which makes it possible to crush the same enemy in that corridor, right? So these are kind of normal principles. One is skirmishing, keeping the enemy under constant fire, which is unnerving. Again, if we pick a single arrow, practically irrelevant damage of any kind, but all the arrows together repeatedly, first of all, they will make some damage physically, but especially they will be annoying and unnerving from a moral point of view, and millions of arrows shot and never ending. So you say, when is this going to end? And never closing in, which is the worst, because you have adrenaline pumping and you're basically cooking in your own tension, and you're weakening yourself. That all that force is spent that you could have invested in a charge that never came because the enemy didn't give you the opportunity of being charged. It's terrifying. That's how you defeat an enemy, even before coming to grips with him, and not necessarily it's going to always happen. Again, the Mongols were defeated at some point, and their armies do not work magically in a different way than others, right? Also others do this, but this was just their preferential thing. And again, it's a strategic disadvantage. If they had had the force of simply smashing in, they would have done it, but they wouldn't. They would have had to wear the enemy out. And this means that their entire military system is designed like that, to, in a sense, declare that normal avoidal of combat. The same goes for the idea of leaving kind of space open for the enemy to fight, even a fakely created one among the lines, so that they could crush them through it. This also happens, say, less rarely than we think, because battles are pretty messy and you can't quite surgically and precisely, carry out this tactics effectively. But in a broader strategic sense, and even partly tactically, it's something. Considering, especially the horse archers, are first of all a softer obstacle than, let's say, strong heavy cavalry line. So normally some parties of heavily armored enemies would try to break through them, maybe even successfully just by themselves. But the horse archers as light cavalry, have the capacity of being very flexible in the field, so they don't really have a solid formation, especially when after the battle has begun, which is a mess and everything goes, say, pretty oddly, and they just have to shoot all together, right? Then formation is important in theory, the rhythm of the volleys too, but let's not exaggerate. especially in this whirlwind of of so many of them that are not even meant properly and trained to remain in formation, that one just to shoot over and over again, allows to have this kind of plastic formation, especially on the wings by a certain degree. The Mongols also do not hesitate to flee when they see that the enemy is superior. They are not afraid of a long pursuit because generally, as we've seen, they have an advantage of it. They have lighter and fresher horses normally. At least they had always the spare horses, but they also suffer like all the others, and warfare is never about the eternal availability of resources, so not even the Mongols enjoyed this situation by default all the time. They just would plan that very well, and as we've seen also with some logistical cost, etc. And by drawing back, they also can cause losses to the enemy, as they can use that kind of so-called Parthian shot. They can they have a flexible retreat, like an elastic retreat, as they are in fact also able to maintain their cohesion easily. The aforementioned flexibility allows them with a whistle to turn around all at once and overwhelm the adversary, right? So it is feasible, and they're surely capable of regrouping easily, just running away at the same time, and especially when the enemy is broken in pursuit, it's they're more vulnerable, and so if you can't put together this amount of horsemen, even without good order, but just reuniting so quickly, you can overwhelm a pursuing enemy quite easily. In fact, the Western sources advise not to pursue for too long, because they knew what the Mongols were capable of. All the Western sources stress the use of ruses of war. Archbishop Peter of Russia affirms that women also rode horses, saying that they themselves knew how to use the bow with formidable efficiency. Plano Carpini says that if women are incorporated in an army this way, it's rather to give the illusion of considerable numbers, and the Mongols go as far as to hoist dummies on the backs of horses to reinforce the impression. There was this stereotype dating to classical sources that the steppe peoples were kind of barbarians, especially from an Hellenic point of view also, which I presume that the Russians were informed by Byzantine influence. Especially the Sarmatians, these peoples had to look like the world upside down, and the Mongols fit pretty well that classical narrative. And the fact that these peoples were nomadic, and also women knew how to horse raid, and there were some warriors among them, but it was not like the normal habit in a way, and especially there is no evidence of this in Mongol warfare by cultural even the role of the moment in it. It's possible that Plano Carpini was kind of right? It was connected probably to the fact that the Mongol armies often included broader communities that at a point just followed the army with all their chattel or all their people, so including the women. And it's possible that there were women who knew how to use weapons and fight, but it was not the norm. As silent as the Mongol army could be during the maneuvers to impress the enemy, also war cries before the attack could chill the enemy with fear. As we said, they used stratagems of all kind based on psychological warfare. They used smoke screens to conceal their maneuvers, this kind of things. And as for the strongholds, which are for the sedentary peoples the essential support of the defense, the Mongols hardly cared about them. Or else they took them by assault, overwhelming the defenders with their arrows and the projectiles launched by their machines, or they content themselves sometimes just blocking them, employing for them just a small number of warriors. It was said by Plano Carpini, as if, giving guardians to their pig after having, locked them up in a fence. So this reveals to you, even just properly, an incredibly brutal and careless, terms of human life didn't have practically any meaning to them. I mean, the idea of human mercy thing, it did not exist. Consider that, some sources say that they used for liquid fire human fat. And consider the large amount of deaths that mostly had to do with, think about the massacre of Baghdad or something. That's also, they wouldn't, steppes peoples do not spare resources, so a lot of human fat, would be used to also this kind of mixtures for incendiary projectiles. They used mining as well. They also diverted rivers which flooded besieged cities. So these were all advanced engineering skills that they had gathered, especially also from the Chinese military engineers, which regularly followed their army, and also taught the Mongols themselves to provide themselves with some native versions of them. And when they accept a capitulation, which they're determined not to respect, nothing will prevent them from distributing the prisoners among the hundreds to massacre all those who will not be reduced to slavery. Again, there was no point. There was a broader reason. The Mongols are estimated to have exterminated millions of, but in a sense, especially during the first wave of conquest, it was kind of necessary, right? They had to ensure no opposition could come, because they conquered very populated areas. Think about the Middle East, etc. So no mercy. It's true that at the beginning they were probably more brutal because they just, what do you expect for somebody being raised in the steppes? Later they would kind of civilize as well, and they would understand how to cope with the sedentaries, and because they sedentarized themselves. So there was no other way but to command from the same base of the peoples they conquered at the end of the day, and that's why the reason they became factually Chinese, Persian, partly Turkic in the steppes, etc. Naturally, all of what the Western sources say doesn't have to be taken as true, like any source. But generally speaking, we see here everything makes sense, right? It's framed in a logic which we can, let's say, find elsewhere to confirm this information. And it's interesting how the Westerners basically describe the broader, let's say, character of the Mongols, not just the military aspects. John of Plano Carpini, as we've seen, devoted an entire book of his Historia Mongolorum to the study of the means to be employed also in resisting to the Mongols. That saw salvation only in the adoption of their modes of combat and weapons. So it's as if Westerners were open to the idea of adopting part of the same Mongol warfare techniques, or at least something that was specifically aimed to counter them. John of Plano Carpini also admits not to be a man of war, and of course he was a Franciscan, and he says that the military specialists may have had a different opinion from his, but he still recommends adopting good bows, battle axes, and fanged spears, as the Mongols substantially. This could easily unhorse them, given their way of mounting that was not particularly as stable as the Western one. And he also says you have to run, you have to hasten to capture them, right? Because as soon as they seize their bow, they become dangerous again with the Parthian shot. So in a sense, providing yourself at least with auxiliaries that fight in the same way. We've seen that the Turcopoles in the Near East had absorbed that function in crusading armies in the same way. Also, Plano Carpini suggests the use of double breastplates, which also, wouldn't happen. I mean, plate armor would develop in the 13th century, and generally speaking, following a pattern that didn't have much to do with Mongol influence, even if maybe at the beginning it had been inspired to it in a way. It evolved for internal causes of Western warfare that was already ready effectively to integrate them. It would have probably done it by itself. Consider that even fire, gunpowder, etc., was in the air. Let's say China and Europe were in contact even without the Mongols, in a sense. So this world was kind of evolving in similar ways. Still, for the effectiveness of Western projectiles, Plano Carpini advises soaking arrows and crossbow bolts in salt water to increase their penetrating power. And tactically, he proposes dividing the Western armies into tens and hundreds, like the Mongol ones, launching counterattacks to stop the runners and prevent the installation of the Mongol deployment, avoiding long pursuits, not disbanding the army as long as one is not sure the final retreat of the Mongols, finally, not to garrison in places that are too weak, which are indeed things that military specialists knew already how to take care of by, without this advice. The point is that here, army, all this was done, say all these eventualities, the fact that the lack of uniform organic, the necessity of maintaining a more stable army of sort, being, let's say, more, having a greater control on the same, was a problem that the world was gradually surpassing. As we've seen, the Mongols themselves disappeared, in a sense, into nothingness. They became, China went on, even with Mongol rulers, but still, even though they had influences from Mongolia didn't evolve into a state, right? Europe gradually was, other powers gradually were. So it's again the roughness of the Mongols themselves that made this thing. And what stimulated in Europe in terms of this greater need of military regulation and discipline and coordination, collective training, we may want to think is not to be underestimated. It was a big cultural shock just to know these peoples, even if they, at the end of the day, didn't pose an existential threat of Europe on the longer run. Nor it would have probably in the worst case scenarios. These are the ideas, more or less. There was, of course, the necessity felt to approach a new offensive, right? This was natural because the Mongols were still out there. The empire existed. People traveled there. There were these missions. They knew the Mongols were powerful. They knew they would come back. They knew, for example, of the edict of Guyuk Khan, which ordered all the peoples to submit. And so Europeans were waiting for a new clashes for the Mongols, say in the 40s, right? 30 or 50 years later, David of Ashby or Ayton described the Mongols instead from the angle of military cooperation. Times changed. And times changed also in that century for European civilization dramatically, because at this point also the military changes had brought to a greater professionalization of the army. It's the peak of feudal warfare, of communal warfare. Europeans really deploy an astonishing amount of military power, and they're dominating pretty much everywhere, overflowing from their boundaries, right? Aethon the Armenian is concerned with avoiding too close an association, even because he thinks that he was in the middle, so he feared to be squeezed, but also for another reason, because as a Christian, and one that would, as a be in between of in this region torn apart by holy wars, etc., realized that the mores of the Franks and the one of the Mongols were too difficult to reconcile. And this was a very clever observation, because it was true. As we were saying before, the Mongols remained Mongols. The Westerners remained Westerners, but in this sense went beyond because of it. And the Armenian ruler strongly advises also to complete the western course of battle by the course of Mongol foragers, anyway, which again seems pretty much similar to what the Turcopoles did in crusading armies. So it was not new, but probably Mongol foragers were even wilder and more effective, let's say, than the Turcopoles, that sometimes were just Westerners trained to fight like Turks, practically. And there would be an interesting chapter to open about also how the Mongol invasions impacted Middle Eastern warfare, Islamic warfare in general. It's quite relevant. Consider that the Muslim world just at this point was kind of managing to finally expel the Crusaders from the Near East, and the Mamluks stopped the Mongols, as you know. And there are interesting historiographic insights about that battle, which, again, the outcome of which doesn't have to be given for granted. And so you understand, by the second half of the 13th century, Europeans are fundamentally reasoned in terms of how to integrate, if anything, or to cooperate with the Mongols from a military point of view in this broader, mostly crusading perspective. Naturally, at this point, we have mostly the perspective of Western Europeans, not much of the Eastern ones that in great part were actually under the Mongols themselves and were undergoing an incredible political and social engineering at their hand that would affect militarily the local culture to this day, in a sense. And in a sense, depriving even the local historiographies of that kind of middle class sap that, in a sense, substantiated, as we've seen even in Franciscans, the Dominicans, or commoners' historiographies like the one of the Italian merchants, the travel to China, etc. The analysis capacity that was seen instead like a seigneurial thing that also shared so much of Tartar models of power there. So it's another story, and the Mongol invasions definitely impacted Europe in its kind of softer side in the East, in ways that kind of modeled Westernness in a different way. Probably we overlooked, that we decided to forget in part, but that was instead probably one of the single most impacting cultural and overlooked thus cultural phenomena of the time and beyond. And generally speaking, already from the second half of the 40s of the 13th century, there were travelers that had pushed to the up to the Mongol lands and lived within them, and that had debunked so much of the myths that had circulated about the Mongols, right? For example, may seem strange, but André de Longjumeau, there was a Dominican meeting with a Mongol corps in the south of Caucasus, evaluated it at 300,000 cavalry, which of course is not true. Like, there would have been 30,000 to this point. But even this monstrous cipher is less than the infinite number that the previous chroniclers talked about. So even the dispelling of the illusion of the countless invaders shows a greater confidence in the fact that these monsters from the steppes, after all, were not invincible, were not really something, sent by God to destroy, right? The sinful Christians. In part, they had been a harsh punishment, but the metus hostilis here was decreasing, right? And just a few years before, the Mongol armies had devastated Central Europe. Also, a weakness in the Mongol armament is pointed out for the first time. Europeans found out that the Mongol cuirass was actually less impenetrable from behind than from the front. As we said before, that was a weak spot. The rider uncovers himself when he takes his arm out of the armor to fire from the bow, leaving his armpit exposed. Also, the Mongols are not considered to be invulnerable, to be, incredibly more resilient than other humans. Plano Carpini himself, after all, states that the Mongols are actually less numerous and also physically weaker than the Christians of the West, which is a big deal. He was saying, these people are even less than us. They're physically weaker than us. And warfare at the time was a much more, a matter of body against body, right? Physicality against physicality. And so we are more, we're stronger. War is made basically like that. We shouldn't fear, right? And this, and we've seen how intelligent John of Plano Carpini was in his cultural assessment. So the fact that he needed to point this out, I think it's quite meaningful, because it speaks of of a concrete, let's say, he doesn't digress in this aspect particularly, but the idea, just they are less, right? They live in places where probably so that they were more scattered, they were just something else. Like the West seemed just more, and was objectively more cohesive and compact, etc. Where was this infinite source of, Mongol warriors, and they weren't even as strongly fit as the Westerners. And this, on the fitness, again, we can debate, because everything, again, is functional to a certain end. But just in combat, this was thought to be in absolute terms still, exactly because warfare at the end of the day is still balanced with the odds, does mean something, especially in hand-to-hand combat, right? So these things do matter. And Plano Carpini also puts forward the arguments likely to galvanize courage. Christians must know that if they submit, they will be subject to harsh slavery. Also, Simon of Saint-Quentin insists on this. So this will be a risk for the soul to lose it, right, under the Mongols, because they are betraying Christ. And consider how we were saying before, the Lithuanians, the Russians accepted Mongol overlordship at the end of the day to save their lives. But what about their souls? Peter of Russia also met with Simon de Saint-Quentin to affirm that the Mongols themselves fear the Frankish warriors. This is really a thing. And we're talking about the Westerners specifically. So it's no surprise, actually, because the entirety of Western warfare at that point was spreading objectively from the what we call the broader Frankish civilization. And yes, that was a hell also of a military culture. And of course the Mongols feared that. They had met them in combat. They knew they weren't giving up easily. They knew they were advanced. They knew they had good armor. They knew that in spite of the defeats, they were really know how to fight to the death with all their strength. So there was a system there, they realized, that probably also surprised them, because they had met so many enemies that had just given up, or even when this hadn't happened, like in Japan or in Southeast Asia. Well, this was due to some specific factors that didn't seem probably so impacting, punching like the Western ones, where, again, how do you conquer that land so heavily populated? So compared to the steppes that they had conquered, because let's be honest, but even though great part of, say, part of the steppes weren't at all depopulated, and actually places like Merv that incidentally were destroyed by the Mongols were literally the largest cities in the world. Europe was really a much more homogeneously massive pool of people and resources than practically anywhere else. Not even the Middle East was like that. I mean, just China could compare, right, with Europe objectively in that same fashion. Even India was relatively different in some ways. So we're talking really there about something about Western civilization that the Mongols considered, and after all that they decided not to push forward, right, or against, even though was probably also a matter of distance, a matter of political issues within the same Mongol world. I mean, not just because but it's yet another powerful enemy you see is not going to remain passively there. And Simon de Saint-Quentin sees confirmation of this in the fact that the Mongols forbid those who submitted to them to employ Frankish mercenaries, because they feared subversion through the Frankish arms in the hands of the locals. In fact, they themselves were subsequently to hire Frankish auxiliaries. The crossbow, André de Longjumeau says, was one of the weapons in which the Westerners were considered as masters, right? And Frankish crossbowmen fought at Herat, while Arghun Khan employed Genoese marines that also were, generally speaking, famous for their crossbows. And so you realize that, again, a steppes people, not an empire of a dramatic civilization, something else, starts to realize that what they've met here is something else. As they had met China, however, was closer in a sense. They had managed to push it through it, but was also much more kind of, unitarily, say, subjectable, right? Europe was, what was the center of Europe? Yeah, it's assume you take Germany, and then, like, what do the French do? What do the Italians do? What do the Scandinavians do? And plus, what do the same Germans do and other Central and Eastern Europeans, where, again, you have rebels everywhere. You can't have destroyed or taken all the castles, and you need to send supplies from elsewhere, and there is supply lines exposed from hundreds of thousands of kilometers to fight in a dreadfully attritional warfare that you must also have a point of carrying out, an objective to achieve, to come to an end. And what would have that been in Europe? It's very difficult to assess. And generally speaking, Frankish mercenaries, I also made a video about them as mercenaries, for example, in Turkish armies, were proving to be valiant fighters also against the Mongols in this kind of more Near Eastern, kind of more frontier-like scenario, where the Mongols were also suffering reverses at the hands of the Mamluks, etc. Simon de Saint-Quentin tells us how the Mongols, eager to analyze the way of fighting of these Frankish mercenaries that they deemed to be formidable, had imagined plunging two on them, taking prisoners, one against the other in single combat at Erzincan in Turkey, so to determine, like, let's see how they fight, right, and what they're made of. And so this is remarkable, because also the Mongols had a hell of military, pride and culture and physicality and forms of trainings and martial arts and so on. So thus, at this point, it's obvious that the tides had turned, right? The superstitious fear that the first appearance of the Mongols had sparked in the Westerners had been partly dissipated, right? An enemy is an enemy, and it's scary, right? Also think about the Turks. There were these ideas of fearing them because you may never know what they do, and it's still a world where governments cannot ensure anywhere kind of a, peace and security, and you always have to take up arms for some reason. But that was not the major problem the Westerners had, right? And this comforted them even in the still what it was perceived as possible, also considering the threatening Great Khan's letters to the papacy, etc., that a new attack would have come. And it wouldn't, right? It would have not succeeded. I mean, there is no historical possibility, after all, after the 40s, to see for how things went. Of course, they could have changed, but it was not like another useful moment in which this could be carried out consistently. The early times were, as often, the most promising in a sense, but even there, doesn't seem that the Mongols had a broader favor. It's just the West was impressed, wrote about it, but again, we don't know exactly what the Mongols thought. Observers agreed also on the fact that the Mongol army was infinitely more rustic than the one the Latins could oppose. And this was seen as an edge. As we were saying before, moral forces, this primitivity, this brutality of the Mongols was exactly what had made their own invasions, what had made their own success. And this is the point. I guess it's incredibly important to stress. Like, if you look at Eurasian history, you always have this tides like of peoples coming from ever east, right? And the others, what does happen to the other? They gentrify, essentially. And so the Mongols were actually the last of these peoples coming from literally the most underdeveloped areas of the Eurasian steppes or practically so. Yes, of course, they were Sinicized, they had important context, but still they were some of the last to be civilized in that regard. And then those waves finished. And so this idea of the primitive brutality of the barbarians that managed to morally make this wave, but then unavoidably either get dissolved or absorbed by the more civilized cultures on the longer run. And surely Asia had an important Mongol legacy in models of power, etc., but factually, again, it was not their powers that would rule from Mongolia anymore. It was others, factually. Is perhaps the true core of this all, right? The true explanation. It's not all the technicality or the... You see, a Mongol horseman was said to could live for long days solely on mare's milk, game, and a little of that powdered meat that was simply thrown into the water, in which André de Longjumeau and Marco Polo know, for example. The Mongols' horse is content with grass and bark. On the contrary, the Franks ask for abundant supplies and do not know how to prevent themselves from wasting. Big horses need barley and oats and fresh water, right? Certainly, the Westerners are capable of standing up to the Mongols in open field. The Mongol sovereigns showed that they recognized their warlike qualities by recruiting them among their bodyguards, crossbowmen, sailors, right? But an indisputable element of the superiority remained with the Tartars that still brings, like we think today, the Mongols, something scary and terrifying. And it stands in their frugality, right? In this thing that is, I think, for a civilized people is the scariest of all. Like, the fact that these people can accomplish so much by being apparently so, in fact, barbaric. I mean, without having any other occupation or broader view or concrete kind of development, right? The this fear of the raider that comes to pillage because it doesn't have any other purpose. That's the entire ethos, right? So it's the frugality that, as we've seen, considerably lightened, for example, the logistical part of Mongol strategy. It wasn't a super state. It wasn't, a progressed civilizational development. It wasn't, no, but in fact, these peoples were habituated to live in the wilderness, eating carcasses. I mean, the same Temujin basically had to live like that in conditions that in the West were long forgotten since, I don't know, the Bronze Age or even before. I mean, in that same amount by scale, right? Rising an army in the West was a heavily and costly operation because the power of the single polities that made it up was, say, a break in competition for the same others to build things further, and therefore to stimulate a new thinking, to widen the horizons, to research further, to invent new models scientifically, rationally. The Mongols had practical intelligence, and a hell of one, but it ended there, right? So the idea of, for example, even ending, like conquering the world, right? How would a Westerner believe that at that point, if not intentionally as feeling superior, right? But without coming to some broader meaning of, and decision and cooperation, right? It took a very gradual, consistent way to arrive to Europeans taking over the world. And they impacted it in a much more radical way than any other civilization. So there is a phrase from William of Rubruck that I think is one of the most beautiful ones that I've read from the Middle Ages ever. This was written to the King of France, Louis IX. And so it was the most powerful ruler of his times. In this phase where also the possibility of a joint Christian and Mongol crusade against the Mamluks to retake Jerusalem was feasible. That is extraordinary. And he says like this, and listen very carefully, because these are those kind of phrases that you do not forget in a lifetime. It says, "I tell you with certainty, if your peasants, I do not say kings nor knights, accepted to live like the kings of the Tartars and to be satisfied with the same food, they could conquer the world." Here William of Rubruck got the whole point, right? This is a bit like people today who complain because they are oppressed. Oh, poor dear, in the 21st century you're oppressed, right? This is a bit the same idea. In the 13th century, we know that compared to us, peasants in Europe didn't live particularly well. Nobody did, telling the truth, compared to us by scale, and there is no comparison. But peasants surely were the ones who lived the worst. And here it says, that if those peasants that probably also complained about this condition, or were seen as complaining, obviously, of this, could have essentially the same balls, like mentally, culturally, in terms of individual force and strength, to just be satisfied with the same shitty food that the best of the Tartars, that is their clans, would eat, they would have had the moral force to take over the world. So this is a Clausewitzian concept, that is to say, of course, war is won by moral superiority. Technology, wealth, that's all bullshit. The Mongols didn't have anything. They were a dramatically underdeveloped people. They were a bunch of primitive, brutal barbarians. And they managed to create the empire that they did. And of course, as primitive, crude barbarians, an empire crumbled and was absorbed by greater civilizations. But this man took over the world, right? And it tells you the reason. Because they could live with something that not even Western peasants could have ever lived, right? And we're talking about what their great khans, so who could afford their own best food, would eat. Right? So before thinking that you're oppressed, that you lack opportunities, that you are, a poor victim of the universe that can't do anything because reality blocks you, just think that there are people who accomplished in history. This goes easily back in a couple of generations. Look at how your grandparents lived. That you're just a too disgusting slob to afford to even pretend to dream to become ever in your entire life. And for them it was normality to be like that. And you can't even understand what it means. This is the greatest lesson I think you can learn from the Mongol invasions, because this is basically what you can learn from any other context. And never underestimate moral forces, because you live in a world currently where you have been ideologically brainwashed to believe that everything is materialistic, deterministic, relativistic. It's basically just a matter of preconditions for which you have to fit as a human being in your mind, in your idea of yourself, while the world is the diametrically opposed reality, as the entire history of mankind doesn't show but this. So I hope, naturally, these are kind of still introductory videos that we are making about the Mongols. I'm glad that in the from last winter I managed to make kind of 4 videos I think about the Mongols, and we will keep making others. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.